So, our next paper is Matthew Bingham, who's a PhD student in history at Queen's University Belfast. And he is going to be speaking on baptism, scandal, and the kingdom of God, Baptists during the English Revolution. Thanks for being here. We look forward to your paper.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. The following paper will indeed consider 17th century English Baptists and their critics. 17th century English Baptists and their critics. And in light of our theme, I want to think specifically about how the critics of Baptists during the English Revolution spoke about them very often in gendered, sexualized ways. And what this might teach us more generally about the intersection of millenarian religion and gender and the critical reception of millennial beliefs. So, in England, during the civil wars of the 1640s, millenarian enthusiasm was somewhat surprisingly on the rise. And it was surprising because millennialism, or ecclesiasm as contemporaries referred to it, had been almost unanimously rejected by 16th century reformers, both in England and on the continent. So the Second Helvetic Confession, for instance, of 1566, condemned Jewish dreams that there will be a golden age on earth before the day of judgment. And yet, despite this rather unequivocal...
I'm sorry, did you show the next slide?
I did, and then I pulled it back. Okay. So thank you, though, thank you. So, that's to whet your appetite for what's to come. Despite this unequivocal repudiation, the idea that Christ would return to set up an earthly kingdom of 1,000-year duration was revived among many leading English theologians in the 17th century. This was especially true among English Puritans, who during the 1640s eagerly read books like John Archer's, there we go, The Personal Reign of Christ Upon Earth, which attempted to tease out the millenarian significance of contemporary events. And one subset of the Puritan population for whom the millennial flame burned especially bright was the small but growing number of English Baptists. Baptists rejected the then almost universal Christian practice of infant or paedobaptism and instead insisted that the sacrament be reserved for those capable of making a full profession of Christian faith. And many of them were also decidedly millenarian. So, for instance, the Baptist minister Hansard Knowles, of his 11 published works, 6 of them were devoted to eschatological or millenarian themes. Or consider the Baptist leader William Kiffin, who authored the preface to one of the most well-known millenarian tracts of the period, A Glimpse of Zion's Glory, in 1641. In that preface, Kiffin enthusiastically declared that the day is now dawning wherein Zion's peace and comforts shall be fulfilled, Jesus Christ set up, the sole and great King of his church. So then, combining their millennial expectations with their distinctive sacramentology, many Baptists began to see the rejection of paedobaptism as both a sign of and a necessary prelude to the collapse of Antichrist's kingdom and the establishment of Christ's more glorious and perfect kingdom. A clear example of this comes to us from the parish priest turned Baptist minister Christopher Blackwood, who titled a 1644 treatise with an evocative title that captured some of this union of Baptist belief and millenarian theology. He titled his work, The Storming of Antichrist in His Two Last and Strongest Garrisons of Compulsion of Conscience and Infant Baptism. Blackwood informs his readers that he, having formerly seen the mischiefs of a half-reformation, he now writes his treatise out of earnest desire to a thorough reformation. And the rhetorical juxtaposition here of a partial reformation already achieved with a more perfect, full, complete reformation earnestly desired, this is a standard Puritan trope. And yet here we see Blackwood putting a Baptist spin on an old saw as he ties the more thorough reformation to the repudiation of paedobaptism, metaphorically described here as a storming of one of Antichrist's last and strongest garrisons, namely paedobaptism. And he writes then that his own historical moment is one of supreme eschatological significance. He says that it is a great providence that this truth had been rediscovered in a, quote, most seasonable time when men are upon such a general inquiry for truth. And in privileging his own historical moment then as one of supreme eschatological significance, Blackwood signals that he and his Baptist allies are firmly in the grip of a wider Puritan millenarian fervor. So 17th century English Baptists then, like Hansard Knowles and William Kiffin, Christopher Blackwood and others, were strongly millenarian. But at least as interesting as Baptist millenarian beliefs were the polemical responses to Baptist millenarian beliefs by those in positions of ecclesial and theological power. And during the 1640s, this mantle of religious authority fell decisively, albeit briefly, to the assembly of Puritan divines then gathered to form the Westminster Assembly. And the purpose of the assembly was to establish a new religious settlement, and in doing so to effect, quote, a further and more perfect reformation than as yet hath been attained. So here's the same language that Christopher Blackwood was using, of a more thorough, more perfect, more complete reformation earnestly desired. And yet, unlike Blackwood, the Westminster Assembly saw this more perfect reformation as coming to in existence in almost exactly the opposite terms that Blackwood characterized. Whereas Blackwood looked favorably upon the rise of Baptist churches and saw their success as a sign that Antichrist was on the wane, the Westminster divines saw the exact same phenomenon as a grievous threat to godly reformation. The Westminster divines and their allies were deeply concerned by the threat to religious orthodoxy and civil order posed by various separatist groups. If such groups were allowed to proliferate, they were thought to undermine the unity and order which the Assembly was making such encouraging progress toward. And chief among these sectarians, as they were known, were the Baptists. The Westminster Commissioner Daniel Featley, for example, he proclaimed in January 1644 that of all heretics and schismatics, the Anabaptists ought to be most carefully looked into and severely punished. Now, the concern of churchmen like Featley, it was not limited to theological abstraction. In denouncing Anabaptists, as they called them, and their distinctive doctrinal views, heresiographers of the 1640s constructed a polemical representation of English Baptists that used pointedly gendered and sexualized rhetoric. Baptist ministers were regularly portrayed as seducers who used religious sophistry to take advantage of unwitting young women. So Josiah Rycraft, for instance, described the prominent Baptist William Kiffin as one who, quote, seduceth and draweth away men's wives, children, and servants to be his proselytes. And following this theme, another of Kiffin's critics wrote to him and demanded to know, quote, whether you and such like pretended teachers as you are, be not the persons characterized and condemned in these and such like scriptures following. And then he lists several passages of scripture, almost all of which conceptually bring together false teachers and sexual immorality. So for instance, he quotes from Jude, which describes certain men who have crept in unawares and are now turning the grace of our God into lasciviousness. They are filthy dreamers who defile the flesh by walking after their own lusts. And it's no coincidence then that the Bible verses that this gentleman used to describe William Kiffin all implied lecherous behavior. For such a stereotype by this time was well established in mid-17th century polemic. And of particular concern to these writers was the distinctive way in which Baptists administered the sacrament for which they were best known. Unlike at least in the Western churches, the almost universal practice of sprinkling or pouring water on the head of the one baptized, Baptists insisted upon full immersion. And the mechanics of this procedure required that the minister, the male minister, come into close proximity, rather intimate contact with the one baptized, who is often a female. And so in the minds of some anyway, this close physical contact, adding to the titillation, of course, was the reality that it was taking place underneath the water and usually in some form of dressing gown, and all this proved too much for many Baptist critics. This idea that a male Baptist minister would perform this ritual upon a passive female congregant implied to many that sexual impropriety was a given. And so they made this claim, often with innuendo, often with explicit charges of the same. Daniel Featley, again, is representative here, warning that Baptists are an impure and carnal sect who flock in great multitudes to their Jordans, where both sexes enter into the river and are dipped. And as he continues, Featley becomes even more explicit. He relates an incident, he says, in which a Baptist minister had no sooner instilled this doctrine of baptism into the weaker sex, but two maids immediately, after their second baptism, made shipwreck of their virginity, and a third, dashing at the same rock, played the whore. One particularly colorful source of anti-Baptist polemic of this sort is the satirical Anabaptist's Catechism, published in 1645. And it takes the guise of an earnest Anabaptist who desires to share his faith and practice with interested readers. And the Catechism's first question sets the tone. Question: why are you called Anabaptists? Answer: because we went naked into the pure water, in the presence of the brethren and the sisters of the congregation. And as it goes on, at one point, it mimics for comic effect the common early modern catechetical practice of including questions that would expound the Ten Commandments. And it sort of satirizes this by putting into the mouths of the Anabaptists not 10 commandments, but rather their 10 privileges. Not rules to be obeyed, but privileges to be enjoyed, particularly by the male members of the group. So, for instance, the inverted seventh commandment, which prohibits adultery, in the case of the Anabaptist Catechism, is turned into their seventh privilege, in which we find that no man is to lie with his brother's wife whilst her husband is in presence, except he be fast asleep or dead drunk. But what's particularly interesting for our discussions here is the way in which this well-developed stereotype of, as one ballad put it, the lecherous Anabaptist, the way in which this well-developed stereotype intertwined at points with the Baptists' millenarian enthusiasm. The suggestion was made that the Baptists' supposed sexual immorality was in fact only a foretaste of the scandalous millennial kingdom that they imagined they were helping to usher in. So just as the satirical Anabaptist Catechism imagined Baptists to endorse a sort of anti-Ten Commandments, those engaged in criticism of the Baptist movement imagined the Baptists to be proposing a sort of inverted anti-millennial kingdom of debauched misrule. So consider, for example, Ephraim Paget's encyclopedic heresiography, in which the author, he first associates millenarian enthusiasm with the Baptists, and then he goes on to describe their imagined millennial kingdom as one in which they should, quote, enjoy all pleasures of the flesh. They believe, Paget explains, that, quote, after the resurrection, Christ's kingdom should be on earth and corporeal, and that men should live in carnal concupiscence and lust for 1,000 years. Another vivid example of this comes from the Presbyterian Thomas Edwards, whose sprawling 1646 Gangrena made him one of the most notorious of all the mid-17th century heresy hunters. And throughout the work, Edwards devotes much attention to Baptists. And in particular, he displays, as Ann Hughes has put it, an unhealthy fascination with the dipping of naked women. And at several points, this sexualized critique of Baptist practice intersects with Baptist millennial views, as, for instance, when he describes the Baptist lay preacher, Thomas Collier, luring female converts through the preaching of Isaiah. Except Isaiah, which is well known for its millennial imagery. This is, for instance, where we get the image of lions reclining with lambs. This all comes from Isaiah. And yet when the Baptist minister goes to preach on this most famous of millenarian biblical books, he does not take a passage about lions lying with lambs as his text. He instead, in Edwards' imagining, takes Isaiah 4:1, the key portion of which reads, and in that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man. And so what he is suggesting here then is that Edwards' millennium was not the lions lying with the lambs, but rather this text, in its context, was a a prophecy of divine wrath imminent. In this text, Isaiah is prophesying divine judgment against Jerusalem. He's predicting an instance in which the male warriors of Israel are so decimated from their defeats in battle that the remaining women will enter into a desperate and shameful polygamy. But for the Baptist preacher, as imagined by Thomas Edwards, this is not a devastating judgment to be avoided at all costs, but rather a sort of millennial paradise to be eagerly desired. Edwards' further description of the Baptists confirms this as he calls them emissaries of the devil, their master, portraying them again as hypersexualized agents of Antichrist, seeking to establish an inverted millennium of transgressive sexual anarchy. Well, all this leaves us, of course, with the question, why were Baptists portrayed in this way? Why were they uniquely, or at least to some degree, uniquely singled out in this fashion? And the answer seems to be twofold. For one, the allegations brought against them had at least some basis in actual Baptist practice. Baptists did mandate full immersion for their converts, and this did place their congregations into what would have seemed scandalous scenarios. Because of the questionable legality of their activity, Baptists would often have performed their baptisms at night under the cover of darkness, which surely added an illicit air to the proceedings. Additionally, Baptist congregations were largely female and yet led almost exclusively by men. And these unbalanced demographics undoubtedly led plausibility to the assertion that Baptist ministers were claiming to build churches whilst actually building harems. For example, the Baptist William Kiffin, whom we've mentioned, he engaged in a public dialogue with Robert Poole after Poole's daughter Elizabeth, who may have only been 16 at the time, and in fact went on to be a renowned prophet in her own right, joined Kiffin's church against her father's wishes. And while there's no evidence to suggest that Kiffin made inappropriate advances, none of the parties involved deny the central charge that Kiffin had, over her father's objections, persuaded or at a minimum allowed Elizabeth Poole to join his Baptist church. In addition to the reality that some of their practices did in fact fit perhaps a bit too tightly with stereotypes, early English Baptists, as we've seen, could be fervently millenarian in their thought, and they often brought this out in their preaching and their published work. But unfortunately for them, in doing so, the English Baptists had inadvertently taken on a shape that was disturbingly similar to that adopted by the notorious Anabaptists of 1534 uprising in Munster, Germany. Led by the prophet and self-styled messianic king of righteousness, John of Leyden, a group of Anabaptists captured the city of Munster in 1534, installed a millennial theocracy there, complete with polygamy and the radical collectivization of property. And they swiftly executed all who dared dissent. Now, the fact, although this apocalyptic kingdom was violently ended by besieging armies and confined to a single Westphalian city, this did not change the fact that the events in Munster cast a long shadow over the early modern mind. And English heresiographers regularly connected the English Baptists then arising in their midst with the events of 1534. So then, in the case of English Baptists, their millenarian belief, combined with some unusual religious practices and an unsavory historical association, to create a potent opportunity for their opponents to characterize them as licentious agents of Antichrist, committed to an inverted anti-millennium which threatened the peace of both church and state. And as we draw our thoughts here to a close and move briefly from thinking about English Baptists specifically to how they might illustrate themes more generally, it's worth noting how both the Baptists' inclusion of women and their millennial expectations functioned at times together to intensify hostility toward them. Elaine Hobby, among others, has called attention to the ways in which the political disruption and religious instability and millennial fervor of the English revolutions created an historical moment in which marginalized voices, and especially female voices, were heard afresh. She writes, "If Britain was really living through the biblical last days before Christ's return, then God's promise of a great overturning meant that women as well as men could be allowed to speak on God's behalf." And although English Baptists, as we've said, followed the more general cultural expectation that women would not serve in leadership roles, their heightened female participation was, of course, evidenced by the striking fact that their congregations were predominantly female. And so these groups of predominantly female worshippers meeting together, often in secret, distressed the authorities of the day. As one polemical response then to this higher female profile was to associate the groups involved with sexual scandal. And whether these allegations were sincere or simply opportunistic, the implication was that the men who organized and encouraged such unprecedented levels of female participation must have had some sort of underlying unseemly motivation to do so. Well, when these gender dynamics then intertwined with Baptist eschatology, the polemic quickly became more heated and the denunciations more vehement. Rumors of sexual perversity fused with allegations of millennial fantasy, a rhetorical synthesis which transformed Baptist ministers from ordinary heretics into malevolent agents of Antichrist, working in to usher in a debauched anti-millennium. And such polemic then seems to have, in some sense, taken advantage of the inherent ambiguity found in any millennial projection, because all visions of a future golden age by their very nature require a radical qualitative transformation of human life. It would seem that even their own proponents can never fully describe what it is they are envisioning. We think of the Apostle Paul's reminder to the Corinthians that no eye hath seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. So the promise of a world reborn, the very aspect of millenarian thought that gives it such an exhilarating charge, becomes in the hands of millennial groups' opponents both a rhetorical force multiplier and a polemical wax nose to be refigured as one's adversaries see fit. This ambiguity allowed the critics of 17th century Baptists an opportunity to fill in the blank spaces, and thus, guided by an exaggerated reimagining of actual Baptist practice, these critics constructed a Baptist anti-millennium in which transgressive sexuality was allowed its full and scandalous expression. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you again for a great paper. We've got a few minutes for questions. Yeah, Justin?
I'm sorry to keep asking this. I really enjoyed the paper, and whilst you're contextualising, particularly of the way that the rite of baptism was so sexualised, is very persuasive. I just wondered if there's one other element when you said why was it treated this way, which you talked about heresiology, and if you go back to the classics of Irenaeus and Epiphanius and the kind of models at the beginning of heresiographical writing, you always get groups who are not liked by the heresiologists being sexualised and often having a male leader who's doing this and that. And some of that accusation often involves the rites that are specific to perhaps, say, a Gnostic sect or something. And somebody like Epiphanius is, I don't know exactly what these people wrote, but somebody like him really, needs some kind of help because his imagination is so kind of lurid and grotesque. But anybody writing, and any educated person writing, would be aware of these models of heresiography, which would be highly sexualised. And even going back to pagan criticisms of early Christianity, very sexualised. And even before Christianity, those kind of heresiography goes back to sort of Livy and the treatment of the Bacchanalian sort of cult. So there's a big tradition of this sexualisation of minority religious groups. So I wondered if that was another element, a trope, not as significant perhaps as certainly as Munster, which obviously is absolutely the template for how things go mad with millenarian and sex. But
it's an interesting point, and I suppose it's sort of, one might anticipate that given that the scriptural references are there that connect false teaching with sexual immorality. I quoted the one from Jude, but the gentleman who was writing about Kiffin, he listed 5 or 6 such references in the New Testament that all make that connection. So I wonder if that sort of sets an expectation that when you see false teachers, as you say, in whatever age you find them, they will indeed go down this route. It's sort of it's a part of their nature as false teachers.
I agree. I just wonder some of the specifics of a male leader corrupting women over initiation, which isn't in the New Testament specifically, is there in patristic writing, which any educated clergyman would know. at the time. So it would have already set a trope. If they're not orthodox, they're up to no good sexually.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So slightly expanding on the New Testament template.
If I may, the heresy, they're very conscious of the tradition you've just outlined. They are reading Epiphanius, they are reading all this material, and it is absolutely figured in the way they're constructing it. So they know all this stuff, and they're seeing it in this. The process of construction they're engaged in is drawing very much on what you just outlined.
Great.
So that's all been demonstrated. So that's factoring.
It's just another addition to your argument.
Yeah.
Please,
Thank you. That was really interesting. Just it may help again to perhaps for others in the room to also focus on the fact that you mentioned the hostility to millenarianism. With this, the people you're talking who are engaged in the hostility to millenarianism, who are writing the heresiographers, are very much of a Presbyterian tradition, and this is about Presbyterian mobilisation in the broader context of an independent and Baptist fight for religious toleration. And this is one of the ways in which they're damning their opponents by allegations of sexual impropriety. And you could add more and more allegations to what you said. There's some even more colourful accounts that I could point you towards. But it's all part of a wider campaign against religious toleration that this is factoring in, which is one of the things that Anne Hughes and others have been outlining, and that this is part of that broader picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it is really interesting the way in which the millennial strands get picked up, because at the time, the Westminster Assembly can't agree on the millennium, as evidenced by their, well, depending on how you read it, their silence on the issue, over against the Reformed tradition of very explicit denunciations of the same. So it's interesting how different groups are sort of picking up on the same threads for their own purposes and appropriating them differently. Yeah.
I was just curious about this anti-millennialism vision that the critics were using, and what's the, you kind of answered it in this debate, but is there any theological significance of anti-millennialism for the people who are making that accusation? Does that lead into an end times, or does it just... The
people who for instance, Thomas Edwards, who has the Baptist preaching this,
kind of
this sort of perverted millennium. I think it's sort of this allegation that these people are so horrible that they're looking at the eschatological judgment of God as a good thing. They've got it completely inverted. So it's not that
they're misinterpreting the signs, and they don't have anything to do with our straight and narrow path.
Well, I think that the future eschatological wrath of God would be the sort of other side of the coin of the millennial paradise for the good and the just. So these Baptists are portrayed as they've just completely flipped the script. They're desiring the flourishing of this judgment, and
Very briefly, one more question.
My question was about the type of criticism that you focus in on seems to be not of a sober quality, right? So if there's a sober criticism between the Presbyterians, between Presbyterians as well as the Anabaptists, would that be worthy of attention as well, primarily to do with doxological or praxeological debates, which do not lead to this sort of, this sort of populist kind of scandal mongering, but similar sort of tensions in the questions around dox and praxis as well, which are perhaps of more sober nature, about conflict between different variations of Christianity at that time.
Yeah, you do see in the literature, it's not all the Anabaptist catechism, of course. You have people giving very detailed refutations of Baptist theology, and you have like a point-by-point back and forth where they are going into these texts. And so in a sense then some of these same clergymen, not maybe Thomas Edwards, etc., but for instance Daniel Featley, who he had the picture with the people being baptized in the nude. Part of his book is some of the sort of scandal mongering, if you want to call it that was described here. But another portion of the same book is actually quite a serious trying to interact and refute what Baptists are saying. But that being said, all those claims are made in the context of these people are sort of beyond the pale, but someone has to stand up and be the champion of truth and orthodoxy and explain to everybody else, lest they be seduced as well. So you do see a more sober discussion, but it's always within that context of these people are really
my point being the
dangerous.
quality of that sober discussion, the refutatio, the kind of the debate tradition of it, internal to kind of, you know, how that leads also into the English Revolution's, if you will, a kind of a pre-democratic debate.
Well, that gets to what Ariel was mentioning about how all this is taking place within a much larger struggle for religious toleration and a new religious settlement. And there is this sense that, you know, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what the future will hold? You know, it's the world turned upside down. So, yeah, very much.
Matthew, thank you.